When it comes to Nintendo and their established franchises, the last thing anyone expects is something radically different. When they first introduce a new franchise, like the recent release of Splatoon, it's usually fresh and interesting. But as they iterate on that idea, it often runs the risk of becoming tired and stale. Sure, they make slight changes to the formula, and even sometimes make deep changes, but they hardly ever mess with the core gameplay. Super Mario 3D Land and Super Mario 3D World were something different and new for the Mario series as a whole, but you were, on some basic level, still doing exactly what you've done in other 3D and 2D Mario games since the 80s. But back during those years, experimentation within Nintendo was far more common. Sure, the company played it safe in regards to hardware and their sales tactics, but what they were doing with their main franchises and the software portion of their business was crazy. Perhaps the best known example of this is when Nintendo of America, thinking Super Mario Bros. 2 was too difficult for the US audience, ported a Japanese game called Doki Doki Panic, made some minor visual changes, and released it under the name Super Mario Bros. 2, which had a completely different set of mechanics to the first game. Another instance of this phenomenon that is far more often forgotten today, though much, much more infamous at the time of its release, is the game I'm looking at today, The Legend of Zelda II: Link's Adventure. The changes here are even more drastic than those in the US release of Super Mario Bros. 2, which at least looked the same as the first Super Mario Bros. In a lot of ways. Zelda 2, on the other hand, is almost completely different from its predecessor in every way. Most of the game's action takes place from a side-scrolling perspective instead of top-down, and it plays a lot like other NES combat side-scrollers. You can still tell it's a Zelda game by looking at it. You have the sword and the shield and the green clothes, but if you swapped out the sprites with something else, there's no way you could know this was a Zelda game. However, Zelda 2 isn't just a side-scrolling combat game like a Ninja Gaiden. It also rolls in a ton of RPG mechanics that actually seem kinda crazy to see in an NES game that isn't a JRPG. Enemy kills and some item pickups reward the player with XP, which you can use to level up your character's attack, magic, and health. There's even a top-down overworld with different towns, dungeons, and caves on it. It even has random encounters. But even with those RPG mechanics, Zelda 2 is exactly what you would expect from a side-scrolling game on the NES. Which is to say this, Zelda 2 is really fucking hard. That's not to say the first Zelda game was easy or anything, but Zelda 2 was clearly made to be extremely challenging. And especially if you're not used to playing NES games, this one's gonna be a real pain in the ass. Which brings us to the ultimate question. Yes, Zelda 2 is incredibly different, and that's great, and I think Nintendo should be taking more risks like this today, even if the outcome might not be all that great on a game-by-game basis. But is this game actually worth taking the deep and likely rather frustrating dive for? As far as I'm concerned, it is absolutely worth checking out. It's a good game if a little challenging, and is relatively cheap on the used market, probably due to the bad rap it's gotten in the intervening years. It is absolutely not a traditional Zelda game, but it is a good side-scrolling combat game. Just because a new game in a franchise is something unexpected or new, does not mean that it needs to be ignored. Every Monday, I review games that are at least 10 years old, and I do it in a modern context, a context that's relevant to you. I tell you whether or not it's worth playing now, not whether it was worth playing 30 years ago. If you like this video, be sure to hit like, and if you like what I'm doing here and want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. Thanks, and I hope to see you again soon.